brigade commanders was the wrong policy. Later on, I didn't know Depew at this time, General Bill Depew. Later on, I got to know him. And Depew contrasted for me the life of a battalion commander, which he turned out to be in World War II, and the life of a battalion commander or anybody commander in Vietnam. And it goes something like this. When he entered the continent of Europe, I mean, it was to go until it was over. So consequently, he learned more about how to fight the Germans every day he was there. They lost lives early in the campaign. They didn't repeat that and lose those same kind of lives later in the campaign as it went across the heartland of Europe. I'm confident in my own mind that this turmoil of changing commanders took its toll on American troops, because the fighting skills of the commanders, you learned, you sharpened the skills, honed the skills, and then you applied those skills, and pretty soon your tour was up. And so carrying those on for a longer period of time so that you didn't make those mistakes you made in the first 30 days again during the next 2 years. I think that attributed to one, low morale and esprit that later generated in the late 70s or late 60s in Vietnam, and could have been ameliorated by longer tours by the professional at the battalion commander, the battalion S3 operations level, and the brigade level.
When you were desk per, or at any time during your subsequent experience, you get a feel for what the rationale behind the limited command tour was?
No, it didn't. That'd be subject of a separate review about that.
Apparently it was going on in Korea also, during the Korean War. David Hackworth in his book describes one of his battalion commanders as being a finance corps officer who was assigned to command an infantry battalion as a career improvement. And he was a disaster.
I think the whole notion of trying to rotate it around in order to serve some sort of interest level of professional officers is a mistaken philosophy. What you're trying to do is serve the lowest ranking soldier, and therefore it is the experience that counts of the combat sharpened leader. Whether he starts as a captain, moves up to be a battalion S3, comes up to be a battalion exec or a battalion commander, he lives to do all that. I think that this notion of saying we're going to rotate people into these billets is a misbegotten policy. I think what it takes its toll on is the young soldier who could be ordered to his death or led to his death because of improvisation by not combat skilled leaders. Now, I don't indict every leader now, don't misunderstand that. I'm just saying I'm mindful of the Mary Kay precept. Mary Kay told me when I was chief of recruiting that 15% of the people excel without further ado, 70% of the people have to be inspired to be all that they can be, and 15% of the people can't be all they can be, and therefore you should get rid of them. The argument of saying stick with it until it's over is meritorious because, one, it focuses on getting the job done and getting it over. See, if you think you have an inexhaustible till of people, then you can string it out. If, on the other hand, you say, I've got to fight this thing and get it fixed and get it over with, and the people I have are going to stay with it to the end. May have to keep adding more people to replace casualties, may have to force larger, we're bringing in more force. But I would tell you, you don't go through the learning curve every time that you change a commander and put in a new commander. There's a learning curve, no doubt there's a learning curve about that.
Yes.
Now, in the Desert Storm operation, the Chief of Staff of the Army, General Bono, had to come up with a recommendation that I know about to the Secretary of Defense. It had to do with how long would we stay in Saudi Arabia before launching the attack, and whether or not forces would be rotated out there, and the answer was they would not be. So I think that was clearly the right kind of decision, and I think that people like Carl and Norm Schwarzkopf and others who were in the younger ranks in Vietnam, like I was, learned over there that the duration is better than this shuffle of people and shuffle of competency that happens when you got these rotation policies that are 6 or 8 month battalion command tours.
Of course, with a war like Vietnam, at some point, lasting 10 years, you have to come to grips with the fact that people wear out or people reach their fear bottle fills up.
Yeah, their fear bottle may, and I think that is a problem. What might be sort of a notion to take a look at would be one, did you have a strategy? And then it is your personnel policy tailored to meet the attainment of the strategy? Or is then the personnel policy tailored to aggrandize either the professional officer corps or the professional non-commissioned officer corps? Now, if you go back and look at some of Dupuy's writings, he wrote a rather lengthy article that said we didn't have a strategy in Vietnam. He wrote that in Army Magazine a couple years ago. And so maybe if you don't have a strategy, then it hangs on for 10 years. But that's another problem, is how long does this thing go on? I mean, you have a 10-year fight. Because one of the things that can happen in a 10-year fight where you're not achieving the ends that you desired, that's where you don't have a clear objective about what it is you're trying to do, is that pretty soon you get in a rut and you have stultified thinking by your commanders and all that. But again, I think that's a function of the strategy associated with what it is you intended to do. And I am persuaded that one, we didn't have a strategy in Vietnam that you could record very well, and two, the personnel policy was not necessarily tailored to support the non-strategy. The personnel policy was tailored for a totally different purpose, which was to rotate people through there and let everybody serve 13 months or so and then get out. I mean, that brought in the draft, that brought in more OCS graduates and all that kind of business, which we had to dip in the bottom of the barrel as the outcomes that My Lai would foresee. And we had too rich of a draft deferment system. Kept the good people from getting drafted. So all that, from a historical point of view, one of the things we ought to do is we ought to knuckle down, why did we go do what we did? And we know why we came out of Germany on a point system after World War II. There were riots. victorious American troops rioting to get home, because the war was over. So the behavioral scientists gave us a point system to make things, quote, equal. Well, there's no such thing as equal war. I mean, war is a dirty, filthy, grimy, killing business, and it's not equal. And so the idea that you can somehow equate 3 months in the foxhole with 6 months in some rear area thing, particularly in today's operation where the whole battlefield is subject to, let's say, tactical ballistic missiles or whatever. So the behavioralists, I think, unfortunately, gave us a paradigm at the conclusion of the war that tried to make combat equal. It does a point system. Try to make service equal. Does a point system that got you out of the service. So then 4 or 5 years later, we're fighting in Korea, and we say, gee whiz, we got to have a point system, or we got to have equality. Combat isn't equal. It's not an equal opportunity operation. And so therefore, when you look at equating equality and points and rotating people and the like, as opposed to getting the operation over with, we find that beginning in Korea and later in Vietnam, we're into attrition warfare, which is unsatisfactory warfare and is to be avoided at all costs. I mean, Somalia tells you once again that's not the way to do it, is go out and do an occasional strike. That's not a very good idea. So, I guess we were talking about the quality of leadership. I think there are plenty of people that were high quality leaders there. I just think the personnel policy was wrong. Didn't take advantage of their learning curve, and then ultimately their ability to take care of their troops while accomplishing the mission set out.
There was another personnel policy mentioned in the group and your battalion operational report lesson learned. That was called infusion.
That was the policy of ripping the battalion apart, that they come in holistically, and then we, quote, infused, unquote, the new battalion with troops.
So I wondered if that was what that term meant.
That's right. Now, you said that that battalion got there in
Between the 15th and 30th of April.
68.
68.
And of course, I left in 68, November. Yeah, that may have been a battalion, but maybe I had to cough up troops to get infused in there. But the battalion I recall came from California. That's what I recall. But that could have been 5th to the 42nd?
5th to 42nd. That doesn't ring any bells.
Might be it, because then maybe I wasn't the XO, but I had to furnish people to go infuse that battalion. That could very well be.
Maybe you'd written the letters before you became commander of the battalion. Written the letters as
When did the advance party get there?
15th of April.
Yeah, that just needs chasing.
Well, I'll look again. It seemed like this was a fit. It was the only one with.
Did we talk about infusion with that particular battalion?
No, it talks about infusion in general. You lost 1 officer and 3 enlisted men, I think, in the period between May, 1st of May and then July.
Well, the point is made, whether it's that battalion or some other battalion. The point is that there was, I may have mistaken my role in that thing, but the point is that there was a policy to try to stretch out the rotation pattern, since that unit had all come into one time, so the unit would not decay and go away on the anniversary of its arrival based upon the 12 or 13-month tour. And the trick was then is to send in NCOs, send in officers, take out NCOs, take out officers, take out little troops, put in other little troops. Crazy policy. Destroyed whatever that battalion had coming in. You might look in the after-action reports and find out later on whether that's the battalion that dumped the rounds on the USRV aviation pad. If it is, that's the battalion that did it. Because that was an exciting morning. Fired 3-200 out and dumped a load of rounds on the USRV aviation pad. Bruce Palmer was the USRV commander, and he didn't like that.
I wanted to ask you in connection with this general business of command tours and rotation. You had a couple of group commanders, Colonel Norris and Colonel Powell, and I wondered if they were artillerymen or were they
Oh, yeah.
thoroughgoing artillerymen?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Both of them.
And just to note, that helicopter that had the cracks in the tail boom, when the aviation officer came down, did they proceed to deadline the helicopter?
You bet. They brought in a lowboy and lowboyed it out.
Yeah.
And deadlined a lot of helicopters that day. That genre of helicopters, because they have, I don't know how many
Sort of
they
a
finally
plastic
got.
tail boom, isn't it?
Sir?
Sort of a plastic tail boom?
No, it's a metal, a light aluminum metal tail boom. It came out of the top of the egg. Sort of were in an egg-shaped front end. OH6, I believe, is the number. And they had a long, thin tail boom in the rear, and I'd say that tail boom was probably 6 or 8 inches in diameter. And they deadlined a few that day. Metal fatigue. I mean,
Right.
tremendous amount of vibration going on, so I just had metal fatigue.
You described the ground attacks on headquarters battery compound as sort of a routine thing.
Occasional, yeah.
And mortar attacks frequent. And
Occasional.
What were the responses of your troops to those? I know you were on the road all the time, the XO would probably know this better, but was there... This is pretty stressy business.
Pretty what?
Pretty stressy business.
Stressing?
Stressful business, yes, being...
No, it wasn't near as stressful as the troops in the field had it. I mean, we had a little headquarters compound, and they would probe it and attack it. And as a matter of fact, after I left, they had a substantial attack on that. And my XO had become the S3, Ed Soyster, and later Lieutenant General Soyster. He got severely wounded in one of those ground attacks. But while I was there, I would say there were several. There were mortar attacks, probed, see whether or not you had some defenses. If they could have knocked it off, they would have. But the fact is, we had reasonable ground self-defense capability with the small arms we had. And occasionally we would have dusters logger overnight, and occasionally there would be a 105 or the 155s might be in position in there. That was rare, but sometimes we had that in there. Transient artillery. So I wouldn't make any more out of it than it was. We had some. Troops always reacted with alacrity. The only time that we had problems when the sergeant major crapped out. And I'd say we had less direct hostile action than most places did.
Troops handled it with comparative aplomb.
Pardon?
The troops handled it with comparative aplomb.
Yeah, I mean, troops were well rehearsed and had a counterattack force and sweep out to 3,000 meters, and we had patrols out all the time. We were living close to an Arvin Division headquarters, so we'd get some support from the Arvin Division headquarters. But when the Arvin Division was out on some big operation, that's normally when we'd get some probing attack. So, I mean, it was routine.
Right.
Nothing exciting. Not like the Yadrang Valley.
Doesn't sound like that. Were your battery commanders let's see, that's unlikely that they would have been second tour Vietnam vets. Said they were good. I wonder how they got that way, what sort of, did you have any feel for what their backgrounds were?
No, they showed up, and Gunter, I think, had had a previous tour as a special forces officer. And Marlowe is Gene Marlowe is the other guy. Because I've been trying to
Remember him?
dredge up his name. Gene Marlowe. Marlowe ended up being a full colonel in the Army and doing superior work in the acquisition business. Gunter was a guy over in Germany, ended up being my liaison officer in Germany when I was TRADOC commander. Jay Pennywell ended up being a full colonel in the Army at PMS at Prairie View A&M. And those were the three pillars of the fighting battery commanders, and all three of them came with whatever their training had been, were put in the jobs and performed magnificently, and all three of them ended up being full colonels in the Army, which I consider to be a successful career in the United States Army.
Oh, yes.
So I think that I was blessed with competent
Three pros.
three pros. They had to operate decentrally. That is to say, they had to get along, Marlowe with the Australians, Gunner with the 9th Division and with the 193rd, I think, down there. Jay Pennywell, particularly with the 101st and with the Arvin, north of Saigon, north of Long Binh, northeast of Swan Lake. So we're all good men, very, very fine officers. All of them commanded battalions. All of them did quite well. Strong, competent. Didn't have to tell them more than once, and they did it. Very mature guys. Knew how to shoot bullets, which is what an artillery officer ought to do.
I have a couple of ORLLs. Would you like to have them or look at them?
Sure.
I'll eventually get the others. These are two from within your command time. Leave them with you.
That's a long time. That's interesting. Carlson was another guy. He took over from Hartmut Gunther there. He's a very good officer. This guy, Al Carson. Interesting. I haven't seen any of that stuff so long I wouldn't know anything about it.
It's interesting, a lot of the things that you talked about last week are mentioned in here, such things as the Killer Junior.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds like there's a lot of problems with the 548 and 548
You bet, still are.
tracks.
Gunner was down there with the 9th Infantry, Vung Tau and all that. Knew he died. I haven't looked at any of that, so, recall's what recall is.
All right.
See, this is Marlowe's outfit. He's with the Royal Australian Field Regiment. B was Pennywell. Always moving around, everywhere from Coochie to...
By boat and by road, whatever. All that movement was...
Well, it was interesting. I don't know. Did you catch that one about boat?
Yeah, one mentioned here. Battery B by LCM.
Yeah, let me tell you about that one. That's a funny story. One of the things I learned when I was a bully was always be at the point of where it could go wrong. Now, David Grange was the lieutenant colonel commanding that battalion for the 101st. And he said, we're going to cross the Donghai River here. We got some LCMs. I want to take some APCs up there, and we're going to take the 155s across this river. And I said, we're going in these LCMs across the river, 155s, LCMs. Is that what you told me? Yeah, that's what we're doing. So I got up there, and this is the first time we'd ever done any of this stuff. So this is a 155 battalion in the amphibious assault.
Right.
So I was on the first LCM. We had some APCs go across ahead of us that belonged to a CAV unit.
They swim on their own, or they go?
No, they were in these a very high bank, very steep bank. And I was on the first howitzer that went across the river. And the engineers have been over there improving the others. I can remember this just like it's yesterday. It was in the middle of the night, and engineers had put down some PSP, and the howitzer crashed through the bank as it came through. And the only thing that I knew was this howitzer was going to the bottom of the Donghai River. And I said to the boatsman who was driving this thing, I said, you keep full steam on the back end of this LCM, pressing the howitzer against the shore. Then I went up myself and got the half a dozen APCs that were across, put them into a train, and got that howitzer up that bank. And then we did some work on fixing the bank so we wouldn't have to do that all the time. I looked back on that, on that particular night, it was not a problem. And the reason it wasn't a problem because I had been in the Honest John business. And the Honest John business was a heavy equipment industry. I mean, big weights, big trucks, M62 wreckers, extra long wheelbase 5-ton trucks, pole trailers. The launcher itself weighed 60,000 pounds, piece of cake. So handling heavy equipment, I thought, you know, was easy. So going and putting a train together to get that stuff out of there was not a problem. I often thought about that later on, that it would have been easy for me not to have been there that night. I could have been in one of my other batteries doing work. But that was the crucial event of the day, and the commander always wants to be at the crucial event of the day, and I don't care whether he's an infantryman or an artilleryman or armor guy or whatever else it is. But it's interesting, that sort of triggers that memory about that.
That triggers another memory. You told me once that when you were in the Honest John platoon, one day you took the platoon into a field and felt the ground, it was frozen, it was hard, it was fine, and it thawed, and every vehicle sank to its axle.
You bet.
How'd you get them out?
I had 4 M62 wreckers hooked up in train and in using winch blocks to get yourself more purchase on the gear and all that kind of stuff. So we spent the night. It's a good experience for a lieutenant. Lieutenants ought to do that kind of stuff. Just get all mucked up in the mud and have to dig out. That was what we ought to do. Well, that's interesting stuff. Read all that stuff. Tet counteroffensive.
This was the months following it.
This sort of gets to the end, 1 November 98, or 1 November 68.
Yeah, the period ends about a month earlier, so I think this is, you probably have one more month of command.
Yeah, another guy comes. See, here's where we turn. Jim Brickman took over from Pennywell, and I mentioned Brickman had been my fire direction guy.
He spent a few months as an exec and then left the battery.
And Ken Gruner turned out to be a fine officer. I think he retired as a colonel in the Army. Got a few silver stars for the troops. Yeah, interesting thumb through that. I haven't read all that. So here we go. The battalion underwent the USRV. See, that's where it came from. Annual General Inspection. Okay?
Okay.
Yeah, I'd like to read those in.
Leave those with you. Last week we left off with a discussion of the War College, and I only have one follow-up question on that. You said that your goal was to be formative in the seminar sessions where it really counted, and I wondered what you meant by formative and what about the seminar sessions really counted? What was it about them? Did you produce a product at the end of each seminar segment?
Well, you had seminar segments, sessions were where the more fulsome discussion of whatever the course curriculum was at the time took place. And the way I looked at it is if you could be persuasive to your classmates in the seminar, be respectful of them on the one hand because each of them brought something to the table. But if in the end game, your ability to summarize what went on, your ability to synthesize what went on, the ability to persuade people in that small group, I thought that was the most effective way to participate in the learning process. But asking questions in the big sleep room was something that was not appealing to me, and is in general not appealing to me today. I mean, I like student interaction when I give a talk, like at the War College, and I gave talks at the War College for 20 years. But as a guy sitting in an audience, it's not my bag to get up and sort of show what I know to some visiting dignitary and pursue some thought train with. It's just not my talent. Not my style.
From the War College, you went to doing the Army program.
Well, it's a little bit more involved in that. I got a job in the P&E shop. It was run by General Maxwell at that time, and I went to work with a civilian named Don Haverman. Don was a crewman on an officer crewman. I can't remember whether he's a navigator, bombardier, or what it was, on a B-17. And he graduated from 2 schools in his life, actually 3 schools. He graduated from high school, and he graduated from whatever skill school he had as an officer in the Air Force in World War II, and he graduated from ICAF. And Don Haverman was the head of the programming shop in then the office of the A-Vice, Assistant Vice Chief of Staff of the Army, whose leader was Bill Depew. So I was put in this shop called the A-Vice, called the program shop.
Was the A-Vice, that's not a permanent thing, is it?
Well, it isn't now, but it was then, and it had a weapons systems shop, it had a personnel shop, it had a programming shop. So it had several shops in it. And I was in the program shop, and Don was the programmer, civilian. He knew every financial system in the Army and in OSD. He was a whiz-bang at that stuff. And so I went to work at his need. Now, my immediate boss was a colonel. And after about, excuse me. So I went to work for the shop, and I had a colonel, either Lieutenant Colonel P or colonel, that was running my little section of the waterworks there. And after several months, not too long, I mean, I had come from being a seminar chief in the last period of the seminar, which is the national security week at the War College where your seminar has to put on a build a POM, build a national strategy, build all the undergirding parts of the POM about that. So that's what I'd done at the War College. Well, then I got assigned to DePuy shop, assigned to Haverman shop. So I felt pretty comfortable about being in that particular shop because I'd learned to do that at the War College.
What is a POM?
The Program Objective Memorandum, it's the 5-year or currently the 6-year program for the allocation of resources to the Department of the Army. Manpower resources, acquisition resources, military construction resources, research and development resources, reserve components resources, and the like. How many people you're going to have in the Army, how much money you're going to have in the Army, and how much you spend on all those things.
Does it include how many buildings will be built at Fort Ord?
Yeah.
Okay, and how many trucks in 693?
How many trucks you'd buy, how many, in those days, how much money you'd put toward research and development for the Bradley fighting vehicle or the tank or the Apache or the Cheyenne in those days, and the Black Hawk, all those kind of things.
When you apply money to R&D, does that include an objective to be achieved year by year with these allocations of money?
Yes. So what it does is the program is the laying down of what the Army's force structure, research, development, and procurement, military construction, reserve components, programs are going to be for the next 5 years. And that's ruled on by the Department of Defense. And subsequent to that, then they issue a budget for that, and you go and defend that budget before the Congress.
Was it the role of the Assistant Vice Chief's office to build the POM each year for the next 5?
Yes. And so you did that on a rolling 5-year. Now, they do it every 2 years. So I became a worker bee and all that. And I became the guy in charge of manpower accounts in the POM. We had another shop that did exclusively manpower work, but I had manpower accounts in the POM. They did recruiting and drafting and other kinds of policy, but I was doing the POM work. A couple of 3 months after I'd been there, the then Secretary of the Army, Stan Resor, was faced with, this is 1970 now, this is the late summer and fall of 1970. He was faced with the restructuring and downsizing of the U.S. Army, not unlike what we're doing now after the Cold War. In those days, we had 1.5 million people in the Army. And the question from Secretary Resor's operation is how low to take the Army, and then what would be its force structure, what would be the needs for the procurement accounts, the research and development accounts, military construction accounts, etc. So indeed what this was it was the process of forecasting what would be the size and shape of the Army after the Vietnam War. So DePuy set up a separate shop, and I was chosen to be the head of that. And he told me to take a few guys and figure that out.
You get to pick them from within the other shops?
I got to pick them from the rest of PA&E, and if I needed somebody from down below, I could get it from someplace else in the Army staff. And as I recall it, there were 5 guys or so at that time.
Were they all green suiters or some of them?
No, they were all green suiters. we were then working with the Army staff and iterating based on what we knew, and trying to set up a plausible reason for why we should have X number of divisions, and then what were the cascading dollars required to support those divisions, etc. In the course of doing that work, we ran through iteration after iteration after iteration, and there was a substantial amount of time spent by me and my little team with General Depew on the one hand, and with me and my little team with Secretary Resort. And I guess that's when I became aware of how you do things in a strategic sense in the Army. In other words, how do you forecast? How do you have a vision of where it is you want to go? How do you generate that vision of where it is you want to go? How then you apply the resources necessary to make it happen, and then how do you develop a sales methodology to carry that out?
How did you get the vision? Did you do that by talking to other staff?
Well, one of the things you do, I'll give you an example. One of the things that you will recall is that at the tail end of the Vietnam War, we were busy drawing down forces in Vietnam, but meanwhile we had forces in Europe that were going through the agonies of the damned with race riots and every other damn thing going on over there. But nonetheless, we had commitments we had to have to take care of our European NATO requirements. So it wasn't like I created the vision of what kind of force structure we need. It was more synthesizing what the National Command Authority said that it owed NATO in what was called the Defense Planning Questionnaire that got renewed every several years with the NATO ministers, both state and defense. And it was the translation of those goals into matters pertaining to what size and shape would the Army need. So you had, and what we came up with is something you well know, because everybody knows what our NATO requirements were in those days. It was 13 1/3 divisions, but then you had to do the calculations. How many people does that take? How many recruits would you need, in those cases draftees, would you need to bring in? What size would the training base have to be to support those draftees, training them? How many people would you be sending to the senior service schools? What would be the transient account? How many people do you estimate is going to be in the prison or the jug? How many people are going to be in the hospital? Then how much money will it take to support the development of what was then known as or became known as the Big Five, the Bradley, the Abrams tank, the Black Hawk, the Apache, and the Patriot missile system? How big would the reserves be? How much money would it take for them to operate? What would be the MILCON requirements, the military construction requirements, overseas and here at home? And then how did you add up all that money and figure out how much money it was going to take, how many people it would take?
You have to crank in Korea, Alaska, Hawaii, that sort of
Yeah.
thing also.
And what we called special mission brigades around the world, like Panama and Alaska, and a variety of places. So
You would have the NATO document, NATO memorandum
yeah,
in front of you?
yeah. We had a guy named Jim Compton that worked on that with us, and a guy named John McDonnell was instrumental in working on all that. We were sort of a little team of lieutenant colonels who knew both the ops side of things, the DESOP side of things, as well as the procurement side of things. A guy named Harry Walker was our logistics guy. John McDonald was our procurement guy. Jim Compton was the NATO guy. Other guys who would rise to some prominence in the services, Max Noah was down the Secretariat at that time. Glenn Otis was in the Secretariat at that time. So we're banging ideas off those guys and synthesizing all that and putting together the necessary documents for Resor to make decisions about. It was a case of this may sound self-serving, but it's not meant to be. It's meant to be a lesson. It was a lieutenant colonel working probably in a lieutenant general's billet at the time. Now we'd give those kind of missions to the desk ops.
Yes, it's interesting.
And tell him to do that. But we're still fighting a war in Vietnam and getting out of Vietnam and all that kind of stuff. So Depew was the kind of guy Depew was, so he seized the initiative and went and did that. Now I recall meeting with Resor maybe 8 hours a week. That's a lot for a lieutenant colonel. And on substantive matters. And plowing that back into deliberations, explaining to him why we had to have X amount of money in the ammo account, and Y amount in the weapons and tracked vehicle account, and Z amount in the research and development account, how many people it's going to take, and all that. And I recall the end game was sort of like, we projected that you could do a 13 and 3rd Division with force with special mission brigades, and you could do that with 761,000 people. Turned out later, when we got to the 13 and 3rd Division, the number was 771,000. But at the time we did all that work, it was at the 1.5 million level force. So I look back on that as sort of a watershed event in my career. Because in order to get the data, interact with people and all that kind of stuff, we weren't the reservoir of everything. We were the synthesizers of a lot of it. And so I got to know the Army staff and how it worked and how to get information out of it, how to push the system. This was now my 2nd tour on the Army staff, and
did you have problems getting desk ops, desk per, desk log?
no, absolutely not. I mean, Depew had a tremendous amount of authority, and it was not a problem. And we tried not to abuse it, although others would say that we did. But people enjoyed working for us and with us, and we got it done. And so the point I make about that is that changed my life as an Army staff officer, because the education was in a period of 3 or 4 or 5 months, and at the conclusion of that, I was probably the expert on the interrelationship of things pertaining to 5-year programs. So I am turned back then, after this project is over, I'm turned back to Haverman. And Haverman makes me then the chief of the program development team, which develops the POM, and I did that for the next 2 years. So I built, as a lieutenant colonel, I built 3 POMs for the Army. And as such, then I was conducting all kinds of meetings for Secretary of the Armies, both Resor and Froke, who succeeded Resor, dealing with OSD, PA&E, which was a fairly strong house in those days. It's now withered and essentially a eunuch on the DoD staff. But in all of that, I would say that 2.5 years as a program guy gave me an extraordinary vision inside the Army as to how to make it work. Interacting directly with General Westmoreland, who was the Chief of Staff, with Depew, with the Vice Chief in those days, who was Bruce Palmer. Dutch Kerwin was the desk spur of the Army. Stillwell was the desk ops of the Army. Distinguished people who knew a tremendous amount, and I learned from all those people. And many of them became my friends, even though we were several grades different. But I mean, I always look at that as one of the, Don Starry was in the forest development business. Fritz Crozen was in the forest development business. So those days in my career were crucial to developing a wider perspective of the management of the Army, management and leadership of the Army. And so that probably was the major change function as I developed.
Why do you think General McHugh picked you
To do that?
to do that?
Well, one, I think, is I had been a War College graduate.
You weren't all of the people in that group?
Well, not everybody, you know. My boss was I think was an ICAF graduate. Haverman was an ICAF graduate. Why they did, I don't know. You know, I think Haverman did that. I don't know why I was chosen. I was an available buddy.
Because it's quite a crucial function, it seems like. And
I think it's the twist. It's the twist of being at the right time in the right place, and something falls on your plate, and the question is, can you accomplish the mission?
you did.